Okay, so as stated, this is our pre-RFR information and feedback session. Nothing that we are presenting today is set in stone at this point, which is part of the purpose that we are specifically calling this a feedback session. We are looking for opinions. You may be wondering why we are looking to update the grant program at this point. We are responding to a number of issues that are somewhat external, as well as some of our own internal priorities. We do anticipate the proposed EPA issue MS4 permit will come online probably this year. Since we're not in control of it, we can't really confirm or deny what the timeline is going to be, but they are making progress with it. And so we think that this is probably going to be the last year of the program on this permit. Not set in stone, but we think that. So as it is the last year, we've decided, not the last year of the program at all, but potentially the last year on the 26 permit or 2016 permit. We are looking at focusing primarily at making it easier for the permit holders themselves to apply, which are municipalities, in part because I don't think it is any mystery to anybody in our audience. It is getting a little bit more difficult at every level to keep the bills paid. So we are aware that the funding pressures are increasing locally. And so that's kind of the big impetus is, again, to make it a bit easier for municipalities to apply for projects that will be directly applicable to their situations. Stormwater remains to be very important. However, it is not necessarily the headline winner of local funding issues, particularly since it gets grouped in with drinking water, which tends to be the one that people really focus on, wastewater secondarily, which gets a fair amount of attention, and stormwater tends to be kind of the third water. So again, we're really looking at trying to, while we have limited funds, try to make the program somewhat more functional for the permit holders themselves to try to kind of, if there's any outstanding items on the 26 permit or 2016 permits, to need to kind of get in and finish it up. So to that end, the biggest changes that we're looking at this year are going to be eligible entities. In previous years, we have required partnership between 2 or more Massachusetts municipalities. In part, that was to spread thin resources further. It was also due to the fact that there are certain elements of the MS4 permit that do allow for regional cooperation and shared items. And so that was part of the initial design of the program. What we're looking to shift is with the eligibility requirements, instead of requiring 2 or more municipalities, 1 municipality can come in on their own without a second municipality directly partnered with them. However, to still get some element of the partnership and regional impact, we would like to still see partnership with the original entities that have always kind of been part of this, which are the RPAs, stormwater coalitions, and similar nonprofits. We're just looking instead to make sure that we've got at least 1 municipality and then again a regional partner to help share information, lessons learned, and things of that nature. We are also making some changes to the eligible projects. They're not huge changes. We're just kind of shifting a little bit. The focus is moving more towards construction or planning projects that seed construction projects. And so previously, the list that is on the screen right now has been running in the RFRs for the last 5 years, I think.
Hey, Courtney,
Yeah,
your slides aren't advancing. We're still on slide 1.
really.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for letting me know that. Now the next question is why? Because on my screen it's showing the move. Okay, okay.
Courtney, I think we're seeing your version of it. We can see the slides like on the left-hand side.
Oh, it's interesting. So it's showing you. How are we looking now?
Now it's in presentation mode, but it's still on the first slide for me, at least.
Okay. Okay, let's try this again. All right. Oh, come on. See, now it won't let me move them. All right. Oh, now everything's moving. Did we move?
Yep, it's moving now.
Hot dog. Okay. All right. Achievement. Let's back up then just for a moment so you can see our slides. Did you see this one already?
No.
Okay. All right. So this was back when we were having, we'll take this quick jaunt down memory lane when we were talking about increased pressure for funding stormwater projects and our three types of water, how stormwater is sometimes not thought of as frequently as drinking water, capital projects, new permit, so on. Eligible entities, we talked about this, how we were previously 2 or more towns, now we're moving to 1 or more towns. And that brings us to our previously eligible projects, and one of my favorite photos that we have in our photo library that was taken by a former DEP staffer in 1985. I believe that one is on the Alewife Brook, but I'm not sure. In any event, the previous eligible projects should be fairly familiar. They were kind of more regionally based, again, because of the partnership. And so this year we are looking at splitting out the projects to be either kind of a regional focus where we can, look at regional projects that are similar to previous projects, like the assessment tools, looking at developing procedures that can be applicable in more than one location, formation of regional enterprise or stormwater enterprises and regional utilities, outreach and education. This year, we are looking at and encouraging for those who have not already done so, the formation of local stormwater utilities and stormwater enterprise funds to help pay for stormwater infrastructure. The design installation of phosphorus control measures on local that are identified in local phosphorus control plans. For people who have other TMDLs for either pathogens or heavy metals, things of that nature, we're happy to consider that as well as long as it's part of the stormwater management program. Investments in equipment and electronic resources that support the stormwater control measures that are part of the management program and prevention plan. Design and installation of control measures and other infrastructure that can support stormwater control and meeting MS4 permit requirements. And maybe the slides will move, maybe they won't. You never know. And they will. All right. There's still no change to ineligible projects. So we do not fund routine maintenance and violations. Those are kind of the big things. So if you're under enforcement order, grant funds cannot be used to remedy your enforcement action. We also prefer not to see a copy paste of a project that an entity has done in one place to then reapply it to another location if it is the exact same project. So we try to avoid duplication of projects that have already happened. This year, we have a few updates to the application structure. There nothing that is a huge deal. There's a couple of new check boxes for certifications for being in good standing with the Department of Revenue and the ability to enter into contract. We would also like a Commonwealth W-9 with your applications this year. We do not accept a federal W-9 at the state. This is painful for everybody involved, so we will provide it upfront, and should you be awarded, it will make your contracting process easier. And we would always love for that to be easier as well. And we are responding, like I said, to some priorities in the program itself that have shifted. The biggest one, of course, being that we're looking to enable projects in individual municipalities The priority, of course, is that it must improve stormwater management for one or more permit holder. The project must be relevant to the MS4 permits and not stormwater in general, but it should be part of either a stormwater management program or a pollution prevention plan or something of that nature that was required by the 2016 MS4 permit locally. So we'd like the project to have existed as an idea, as a stormwater control measure previously. That was part of the planning that went, that was required for the early days of this permit. And so some of those things I anticipate and now at this point, are due for a revisit since this permit has remained in force for longer than originally anticipated. The last thing that is important is that the timeline on this grant program has proven to be challenging. Some years we run behind, some years we don't, but we generally have a fairly short project window. So your project being ready to go at the time of receiving award, which is typically ideally in February, sometimes occurs in March. But projects do need to be completed by June 30th. So it's a relatively short 4-month window. We recognize that is kind of a short period of time to work in. And so having a realistic project that can be achieved in that time frame, the project itself can be ongoing. Just the portion that we fund needs to fall within that window. It can be a little bit tricky, so we prioritize projects that are actually viable for our funding to get fully. And so with that, outside of the unfortunate slide advancement, I think is most of the updates we have. But we'll find out because there's another slide. Oh, there we go. Feedback. All right. Now I'm going to mercifully stop this share. And at this point, basically, if you can use the chat or just raise your hands, and we are happy to take questions and feedback. Opening the chat now. Oh, all right. And all of that's left, all the chat is just tech issues. Okay. All right. So, any takers? Are we allowed to raise hands? I think we need to. But
Hey, Courtney, can I ask a question?
absolutely.
So I just want to make sure I understood this. So the eligible projects include local projects for like phosphorus control measures or stormwater control, other stormwater control measures. But in the so the program priorities would be prioritized higher if it benefited multiple MS4s, not just one. Is that correct? So it would be eligible for application if it was just for one community, but it's going to be scored higher if it has benefits for other areas too.
If there are lessons learned from it that would be applicable to other areas, that would certainly be a benefit. And that's part of the portion of, point of having a regional partner is so that whatever one person is experiencing it, the information transfers so that it doesn't get siloed.
Okay.
And so even if, for whatever it's worth, every project is an adventure. And so we're trying to build up, collective capacity and experience out, kind of out in the wild. And so we do understand that most stormwater projects, however, are pretty local in nature. Although stormwater it's water, it travels. We're trying to facilitate projects that are site specific, and it will score better if there's more regional applicability. But that having been said, there's a lot of versions of what regional applicability might look like and how somebody goes about demonstrating that.
That sounds great. Thank you. Can I just ask one follow-up question?
Absolutely.
How's funding this year? Do you know what your funding is compared to the previous years?
So we have $250,000, which is a very small amount of money. It is similar to previous years. However, because stormwater funding is split into a couple of different places. I don't think I need to, tell the audience that. You guys know that you have to go apply, to MVP, to the SRF, to us, to coastal zone management. There's kind of a variety out there. And so one of the things that Doug and I are working on this year is becoming better friends with our grant cousins and coordinating with them, but also collectively demonstrating local need for stormwater funding. And so I know that we have, stakeholders that we talk to that where their ocean of need is closer to $1 billion than 250,000. So, we're aware that it's not very much money. What we're hoping to do is have it seed, kind of bigger projects.
Thank you so much.
I had a question as well, which was the eligible entities. You've changed it so municipalities don't need to partner up with each other. It can be a one community is applying. Is that one community and an RPA, or is it a sole community can apply by themselves?
It's one and an RPA.
Thank you.
So one of your member communities could certainly partner up with you, or if you wanted to, do something with a few of yours, that's a-okay. But MVPC would still be an eligible partner to the municipalities. It's harder for the towns to partner together necessarily than it is with, the RPAs where they already have agreements. When towns start going to do construction together, we start getting into IMAs and things like that that won't necessarily fit with the timeline of the grant itself. And so if somebody wanted to use our funding to write a bylaw, for example, for a stormwater enterprise fund, that can be done. It's short, the meat of it can be written. It would still go through public process and require a fair amount more time, but those sorts of things where it's just like, if you can get the bulk of the work done during the grant period, it's good.
I think it would be helpful for me at least to see the eligible project list one more time. While you guys are pulling that up, the feedback that I would just generally offer is this is a very tight timeline grant, and I think the best projects are going to be the ones that people are already working on, where this could sort of inject a little bit more funding, make the project a little bit better, or maybe come in and free up some funding for folks. Now I'm just going to be quiet for a second while I read these again.
There we go, screen it up. There we go. Do we have anybody else who wants to jump in with a question? If you exist, I can't see you, so feel free to shout. Okay. Okay, we've got in the chat, Melissa Labanti. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing this. We have a pre-designed project that were developed as part of a DEP community group. Can we complete a project and share that? Give us a little bit more information, and we'll talk about that. Do we have Melissa Labanti still with us? Okay, if you know her, tell her to email us and we'll talk more about that. From Matthew Kinlan, if a project benefited river water quality that multiple municipalities have their own MS4 discharges into, would that be considered beneficial to multiple municipalities, even though the work is for one municipality's MS4? If you can demonstrate downstream impacts, I think that you can demonstrate regional benefit on that.
Yeah.
Can a project be software to assist with stormwater permit and stormwater utility. Yes, we have done software projects in the past. It depends a little bit on what it is, but if it's for an asset inventory or assessment tools, that's absolutely fine. Okay. Anybody else? Oh, okay. Melissa Bonte is here, was having some unmuting issues. There were 3 communities that worked with EP and EPA to develop needs assessments and develop projects. If there is, okay, so if there is a project in the needs assessment that was identified as part of the MS4 program, and just like needs assessment could be a lot of things. And so if it had to do with like catch basins, outfalls, and prioritizing them, that sort of thing, implementing that would probably be fine. Again, it kind of all depends on what was produced locally for the documents to comply with the MS4 general permit. And so if the projects are found within those documents, it's in pretty good shape to send to us. And if that doesn't answer the question, feel free to follow up by the chat and tell me I didn't get it. Oh, I got a thank you. All right. Okay, anybody else?
Yes, I do have one more question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So my question would be would permitting project, say for like a townwide drainage ditch maintenance program, would permitting be a local project that we could potentially get a grant for?
Does the drainage program currently exist?
We
Or are they looking to
currently
develop it?
we currently don't have a drainage ditch maintenance permit
Okay.
in town, so I tried to get one, and it involved a lot more permitting than I originally had thought, because it's all wetlands and like marshes, so everything was considered dredging. So I needed to go through much more permitting than I could do on my own. So it's kind of something that we really need, and I wasn't sure if this would funding for this would be considered for that kind of project.
Off the top of my head, I think probably a little bit more information about what is driving the drainage program, what is draining, where it's draining to, and like what's being channeled to drain. Is it, so you said town-wide, is the town trying to figure out its drainage, like where the water is going?
No, so most of it is outfalls from existing the existing MS4.
Okay.
But over the years, the invasive species have clogged up a lot of the outlet drainage swales that kind of all connect and lead to some of the rivers around town. So
Operation and maintenance procedures were required in the MS4 permit. So if you need to still develop some written procedures, that's potentially eligible, yes.
okay. And would it be, I guess we need we need permitting to do the maintenance and stuff. So it would be like
Yeah,
sampling.
because it's a 4-month time period, that's kind of the one tricky thing that you're going to end up with, is knowing where you are in the project or where you're going to be like 6 months ahead and having the windows kind of hit. We are willing to pay for design, permitting, and construction. How competitive they'll be, if there's something shovel ready, may have some variation. However, it doesn't sound like it's necessarily off the mark. Like there's something very specific driving it, but I think you could probably tailor it to the goals of the MS4 program. It sounds like it. And you're
Okay.
going to be by far from the only person who's got an invasives control issue.
Okay.
When you're done, I've got a whole forest of knotweed for you.
Yeah.
And Matthew, I think we can make ourselves available for, just a call with you to sort of look more into your conceptual idea. And we can provide some contact information to you if that would help.
Okay. Yeah, because I did put
separate from-
together a whole notice of intent and submitted to conservation, and then it got basically got flagged because everything was considered dredging, even though we were just ripping invasives out. That little bit of material stuck to the invasives that we're ripping out is considered dredge material, and I needed a 401 water quality cert and sampling
Yeah.
and a lot of stuff that I can't do by myself, nor have the money to do right now.
What region are you in?
I'm in Marshfield, so is
Oh,
that
okay. So southeast.
yeah, southeast.
Depending on, you might want to, and I'm not sure who is on the call with us today, but we have a gentleman who's talking about a need for water quality monitoring and sampling, and some local nonprofits who do that, and watershed groups may be on this call. And so this is Matthew Kinlan, and he is in Marshfield. The other thing we would really love to do, particularly if we ever able to have people over to the house again, is actually have people in person to facilitate relationships and partnerships, because it is kind of also difficult to meet each other. But you may have a concern that somebody else shares with you in your region, and so I can either confirm or deny. But I hope that somebody does reach out to you after that.
Okay. Awesome.
But certainly reach out to Doug too. And anybody who does need technical assistance on stormwater issues, Doug is your guy. And we are getting a second, the conservation permission to maintain deferred maintenance structures is definitely a problem in other communities. I am not super surprised to hear that. It is a little bit, where regulation and practice are not necessarily in the same place together at the moment. We have an earlier question, target release date for the RFR. Right now we are on track to potentially post it in about 2 weeks. However, this is one of those things that we're asking for feedback. So depending on feedback, we may make further changes, which may cause a little bit of delay, but we're on track right now for end of August, early September, which will put applications due in October. Have any more questions? Okay. Well, all right, folks. Thank you very much for coming and meeting with us today and for giving a little bit of feedback. Like I said, the RFR is on schedule soon. Like it's written. It has been through most of its reviews. It just needs to finish the last of its reviews, and then it will be posted. And as I said, we're probably targeting either late September, early October for due dates for applications. Announcements that usually take about 4 to 6 months to get approved. And then we go into the grant season from there. But outside of your grant project specifically, Doug and I are always available year round, and Doug is available all the time for stormwater issues. And so thank you so much for joining us. There will be a Q&A in the RFR for the grant itself, and I do believe we plan on doing a Q&A session too. Yes, so there'll be another meeting. So that one is less project specific and just about questions for the RFR. But that's what's coming down the pike. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. And like I said, if you've got any questions, just get in touch and holler. And somewhere we'll find all the stop buttons.
Thanks for joining, everyone.